And we're live. Good afternoon, everybody. We've got a special RAGIN with and Geek Speak with Luke Powell from DECRED. We're going to geek out. We'll be right back after this intro. You're tuning in to Geek Speak, a Geek Insider production. We're sitting with special guests in entertainment, news, and tech. So sit back and enjoy as we geek out together right now. All right, you guys, RAGIN with episode number 26 with Luke Powell. And a lot of you are going, what? Blockchain? What? DECRED? What is that? Yeah, blockchain is kind of a scary thing for people. You hear cryptocurrency and people mistake blockchain for cryptocurrency. It is not the same. And they become like doll-eyed when it comes to that. Introduce yourself. Tell us kind of like what you do and kind of blow their minds a little bit. Let's do that. It'll be fun.
Okay, sure. Let's do it. So as the intro said, my name is Luke. I'm a developer for DECRED. DECRED is a cryptocurrency. It is its own cryptocurrency network, similar to something like Bitcoin. It doesn't run on a smart contract platform like Ethereum or other projects like that. So it is its own network. And I think the best way to dive into this would be maybe just dive into the origins of blockchain first, kind of like break it down for those people that might not be, particularly familiar with where this comes from. That's one of the best ways to understand like what blockchain is. So if you're not familiar, Bitcoin was essentially, it originated out of the 2008 financial crisis, right? When the governments bailed out the banks. And its whole idea is that when governments have the ability to print their own money, when it's not backed by anything like it used to be backed by gold, and now we're off the gold standard in the early 70s, and we use what's called fiat money printed by governments, not backed by a commodity. The politicians just cannot help themselves, and they end up destroying the currency because they have this ability to essentially print unlimited amounts of money. And you see this playing out, today with COVID and just stimulus and just the never-ending money printing, right? So cryptocurrencies and Bitcoin were originally created in order to, solve this issue of how do we take money out of the hands of these politicians, right? How do we make it this neutral thing? And the one technology that had withstood the test of time when it comes to government crackdowns is file sharing. Like back in the day when you had Napster running and you could download music illegally from the internet and videos. So even though, the centralized
and even torrents these days for anybody who might not know.
Yeah, absolutely. Like you can still to this day, basically download anything you want. Most people don't because companies like Spotify and Netflix have made it so convenient to just subscribe to their service. But before these companies existed, the way to get your music was essentially to download it off the internet. And
pirates,
so
all of you.
Yes. I don't condone this, obviously. I never did any such thing. But even though the centralized companies like Napster were shut down by the governments, the actual file sharing networks themselves, remained largely untouched. And the reason is because of what we call their peer-to-peer architecture. So when you were sharing files, you were connecting directly with somebody else's computer and you were downloading files directly from their computer, right? It's not some server that is owned by a centralized company, like Netflix or like Spotify. It's my computer connecting to my friend's computer and us sharing files. And this is what's called a peer-to-peer architecture where you're directly communicating with your peers, right? And this peer-to-peer architecture proved to be very, very resilient. So when, the original creators of Bitcoin were looking at, okay, how can we create a money that will be able to withstand, authoritarian government crackdowns, they looked at this peer-to-peer architecture and said file sharing is really the only technology that has proven itself to be able to do this over long durations of time. And that was basically how Bitcoin originated. So Bitcoin is a peer-to-peer network as well. And so is DECRED, the project I work for. And so you can think of it essentially as, the blockchain is basically just this big Excel spreadsheet of transactions, right? And you share this Excel spreadsheet in a peer-to-peer fashion, so directly with all these other computers. And that makes it very difficult for any government to crack down on. There's not a Bank of America server that they can go and say, hey, you guys need to remove these transactions and so forth. And so when people say blockchain, just think about, a shared ledger that is shared peer to peer. And that is really the origins of Bitcoin and the origins of DECRED.
Mm-hmm. One of the things that I tried to explain to a few of my friends, and it may be very, very simplified, is that there isn't a single point of failure because of all of those servers who are making sure that the blockchain remains stable. So if you and I have a server that is helping to maintain that blockchain, and mine goes down because tropical storm Elsa decides to blow through, as long as yours remains up, it would be okay. And
Exactly.
I know that is a very simplified function, but then a lot of people kind of mistake blockchain for cryptocurrency, not realizing that crypto is the layer on top of it. So
yes, well, you can't really disassociate the two because you have to give people an incentive to run that software on their computer, right? Like you said, this peer-to-peer architecture makes the network very resilient because if one person's node goes down, there's hundreds or thousands all over the world to replace it. But that costs money, right? It costs money for storage, for bandwidth, for computational power. That's not free. So why are people running these nodes? And if you want a very large network, you have to provide that incentive to do so. And there hasn't really been very many good examples of being able to disassociate, that blockchain technology from cryptocurrencies, because cryptocurrencies provide that incentive for people to run that software and to be a part of that network and to spend that money, out of their own pocket in order to add security to the network.
Mm-hmm. Well, and then speaking of security and things like that, so now I was doing some reading, and we have had an interview with Jacob Joachim Pyatt a while ago, and so you have this dual way to maintain DECRED with the proof of work and proof of stake. How in the world did you marry those two? Because they are two essentially different things.
Yeah, so DECRED was created by former Bitcoin developers. And well, before we get into this, let's kind of dive a little bit into what proof of work is for people who might not be familiar. So proof of work, like we said, we have this ledger, this Excel spreadsheet of transactions, but then who gets to add new transactions onto that ledger? How are new Bitcoins created? And it's both of those are answered through this process called mining. So if you're sharing this spreadsheet with people all over the world, right? You have to, if you want to add a transaction to it, you have to spend computational resources. You have to solve a computational puzzle on your computer. So spend that electricity in order to solve a cryptographic puzzle. And then once you solve that cryptographic puzzle, you broadcast the solution to the rest of the network. And these puzzles you can think of as similar to Sudoku puzzles, right? It's very hard to solve, or it takes a lot of resources to solve a Sudoku puzzle, but then anybody can look and just be like, oh yeah, this is right. It's very easy to verify. So expensive to solve, but easy to verify. So when you do come up with one of these solutions, you can broadcast it to the rest of the network. They can check your work, and that gives you the ability to add transactions, to create a new block and add it to the blockchain, right? And in that process, when you add a block to the blockchain, you also get to reward yourself a little bit. That is how new Bitcoins and new DECRED are created every day. They're part of what's called the block reward. It's this reward for spending that electricity and spending those computational resources in order to solve this cryptographic puzzle, right? So this was, Bitcoin uses a pure proof of work consensus mechanism. So it relies solely on these miners. Now, what the original DECRED creators kind of saw as they were working with Bitcoin in the early days is that this creates some power dynamics that can cause problems in the long term, right? So there's a couple different groups in any cryptocurrency project. You have the miners, the ones we just talked about. You have the developers. These are the ones maintaining the code, adding new features. You have economic nodes, basically nodes on the network, such as exchanges, Coinbase, things like that. People that are running the software, but they're not necessarily holders, right? Coinbase doesn't own a lot of Bitcoin, but it contributes to the network by running a node. And it also provides these fiat on-ramps and off-ramps. So that gives them essentially some power in the Bitcoin ecosystem, because if you cut off the fiat on-ramps and off-ramps, that's to the detriment of the cryptocurrency. You're
sure.
killing
it doesn't allow people like me to just go in and say, hey, I've got $20. Let me buy into this Bitcoin and DECRED thing.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And so the original DECRED creators, as they are building this Bitcoin software, they kind of saw these issues ahead of time of the people who should be making the decisions are the people holding Bitcoin. Like if you're to hold a stock, right, the people who ultimately control a company are the stockholders, right? This aligns incentives because those stockholders have skin in the game. They're incentivized to, make decisions that add value to that company. And in a very similar fashion, like in an ideal world, the Bitcoin holders, the people who have skin in the game, would be the ones making the decisions about what features get added, what direction the project goes in. But that's not how it plays out in reality because of these different groups and the different power dynamics they have. Like those miners, they're the only ones that have the ability to add blocks to the blockchain. So that gives them a good bit of power. You have like we said, the fiat on-ramps and off-ramps, they have a good bit of power because they control that liquidity. The developers have power because they're the ones that the community trusts. They're the ones that are, giving guidance on these technical issues. And then your average everyday user who might just be running a node and contributing to the network, well, they can choose if let's say the developers implemented something that they didn't agree with, they could choose to not support that software, to not run this new software. But then if the miners and the fiat on-ramps and off-ramps all decided to run it, well, you wouldn't be on the same network anymore. You'd be running something different, and you would lose access to those exchanges and those services. And so DECRED, the reason that we do this hybrid proof of work, proof of stake consensus mechanism is because proof of work is still very good for security. We rely on proof of work for the underlying security. It is really the only consensus mechanism that has been proven to date to work and be able to secure these large networks. But we add on proof of stake for what we call a governance layer. Proof of stake means the people who own DECRED, they can lock it up, and then that gives them the ability to vote on governance issues. It's very similar to shareholder voting in a company, right? So I'm a developer for the project. I run a development team for a specific part of the project. In order to fund my team, I go and I write a proposal for work to be done. I say, hey, this is our roadmap. This is the team that's to be doing it. This is the funding request. And then the DECRED stakeholders, the people who own the DECRED and are locking it up and staking it, those are the ones that are actually voting on which teams to fund and how the DECRED Treasury gets allocated.
Mm-hmm.
So they control everything, essentially. They have all the power.
Right. So how do you then balance against bad actors? Because, the stakeholders, sometimes they're just, they don't know, excuse the term, shit from Shinola, and here they are, making these decisions. But then it's like, okay, so you present something that may cause a fork in the blockchain, something that a change that is required because things are changing in the world, right? So now your stakeholders are going, yeah, that's a good idea, and they kind of come to consensus. But however, your servers, the people who are running that, are not necessarily your stakeholders. So now, wouldn't there be a power play of some kind?
So there's a couple points here. So as far as, let's say, the node operators, the people who are running the software not being stakeholders, they don't have a choice about what chain to follow, essentially, because of the way when a new block gets mined, it gets mined by proof of work. but then it gets validated by the proof of stake side, meaning these proof of work miners solve this computational puzzle, create a new block, and then they broadcast to the network. And then 5 stakeholders are selected out of this pool to validate essentially the block, or technically the previous block. But for simplicity, we can just say they vote on the validity of the block, right? And if they say, yes, this is a valid block, then it gets added to the blockchain. If you were to run any other software, you're not running the DECRED software at that point. DECRED is the chain with the most accumulated proof of work that has been validated by the proof of stake side. So any type of fork, like you wouldn't have a Bitcoin Cash scenario, because the way it would happen would be in hard fork changes are what we refer to as non-backwards compatible changes, right? So if somebody makes a hard fork change, people have to update their node software. Otherwise, they'll be forked off the network, and they won't be, their software will be basically doing nothing or running on a different chain at that point. So when DECRED has hard fork votes, let's just use this Bitcoin Cash example. The way it would have worked is that the Bitcoin Cash developers would have coded up these changes. They would have packaged it up into a release, distributed that release to the ecosystem where the changes haven't been activated yet. They're lying dormant. They're there in the software, but they're not running yet. And then the DECRED stakeholders vote on chain on whether or not we should switch over to this new chain. So if the DECRED stakeholders vote and through this proof of stake component, and they say, yes, we want to switch over to this new version of the change to Bitcoin Cash, then all of the nodes automatically switch over. It's not possible to remain on the old network at that point. Like the software is coded so that it follows the will of the stakeholders, right? Now, if the stakeholders say, no, we don't want to activate these changes, then the chain just keeps on going. That software that was lying dormant continues to lie dormant. And again, you don't, the people, even if they don't own DECRED, if they're running a node, their node software follows whatever the stakeholders want, the will of the stakeholders. So they don't really have the option to not follow it. If they did, if they were to code up their own software, their own custom software, they'd be running their own network at that point. Essentially, they'd be launching their own cryptocurrency. And so this hybrid proof of work, proof of stake consensus mechanism allows for continuity in the project. It allows the project to make a decision. One of the big problems with the Bitcoin Cash war was it became this huge issue for 3 years, and it took up a tremendous amount of time and resources. And what I've experienced is that most of the arguments get put out there within the first month or two, and then after that it just devolves into politics, right? And so DECRED, this voting mechanism, allows us to propose changes, have a vote, have a final decision, and then move forward as a community, all within a couple of months, as opposed to this long drawn out multi-year process. And then to address your other point, well, what if we have, these malicious actors, let's say they do own DECRED and they want to make bad decisions for the network. So when you stake, you lock up your DECRED for a random period of time of up to roughly 4 months. Okay, so anytime that you're voting on some type of governance issue, your DECRED is then locked up, and you're going to be subjected to the volatility that results from that vote. So if you do something that would crash the price, you're crashing the price of that DECRED that you have locked up, and you don't have the ability to sell it until it randomly gets unlocked, after that, sometime during that 4-month window, right? So it creates this skin in the game incentive to make the good decisions. The more DECRED you own, the more influence you can have on the decisions and the being made, right? And so even if, one common point that's brought up is like, oh, well, I own DECRED, I sometimes vote, but I don't have the technical ability to evaluate these decisions, right? And that's a valid point. But the more DECRED somebody has, the more skin in the game that they have, the more incentive they have to actually become educated, right? If you're a large DECRED holder, if you're a fund or something, and you own tens of millions of dollars of DECRED, you're probably going to start putting an analyst onto, the DECRED project to follow and make sure that your voting is in line with your interest and in line with, making this price appreciate over the long term. And so the short version is it relies on skin in the game to align the incentives and make sure that no system is perfect, but capitalism is basically built on this concept of skin in the game. Shareholder voting. Shareholders are incentivized to create value because they own the company, and they're the ones that benefit from that value creation. So it aligns incentives via skin in the game, and which is the best way, in my opinion, and the opinion of most people in the project, of ensuring positive outcomes over a long time period.
Mm-hmm. So now, when it comes to like the value of DECRED, is there a finite amount like Bitcoin? Where after a certain amount, you can't mine anymore. There's no more to be mined, and then after that, it's just whatever you've got out there, you've got. I mean, is DECRED very much like that, or do you keep creating new token?
Yeah. So, as I said before, the original DECRED developers, they were former Bitcoin developers. And so DECRED, they built a Bitcoin implementation from scratch, meaning the original Bitcoin software was built in C++. And in the world of software, we have multiple implementations. And when you make a different implementation of a protocol, that just means building out that software in a different programming language, right? So the original Bitcoin implementation was in C++. The ones that the DECRED developers built, they built a from scratch implementation in Golang. And this implementation is still around. Lightning Labs relies on it for certain parts of their Lightning Network software. And so it was a bug for bug compatible implementation of the what's referred to as Bitcoin Core, that C++ implementation. So DECRED is derived from this Golang implementation that they built from scratch. And so, the philosophy was essentially, Bitcoin does a whole lot of things right. We don't want to mess with that. Proof of work, this 21 million hard cap, and DECRED keeps all of those things and then improves areas where it thinks it can improve. So adding this hybrid proof of work, proof of stake consensus mechanism, instead of the happening every 4 years in Bitcoin, where the inflation rate gets cut in half every 4 years, DECRED, it's the same curve, it's the same 21 million cap, it's just smoothed out. So there are inflation reductions on a monthly basis instead of every 4 years, because it was believed that the supply shocks from these happenings might not be a good thing. Same with the difficulty adjustment. We actually just saw, this is a great example, as these, recently China kicked out all the proof of work Bitcoin miners and hash rate plummeted. So Bitcoin adjusts its difficulty based on the number of people that are mining, meaning the more people that are trying to solve that computational puzzle, the harder the puzzle gets. But that adjustment that it makes, where it will increase or decrease the difficulty of the puzzle based on the number of miners, is made roughly every 2 weeks. And so when you have this drastic drop off, like we saw when proof of work miners were all, basically kicked out overnight and hash rate plummeted, over 50%, that means that block production is going to slow down, roughly get cut in half if it for a 50% hash rate reduction, until that next difficulty adjustment, which under ideal scenarios is every 2 weeks. But if your block production got cut in half, then that extends out that timeline, because there isn't this concept really of time in these blockchains. It's all based on the number of blocks. So the difficulty adjustment, I think in Bitcoin, it was every 2016 blocks that it readjusts itself. So if you get that massive drop off overnight, well, it could be a couple months before of really slow block times of the network grinding to a halt before that difficulty adjustment happens. So in DECRED, this was just another thing that got tweaked during that process of launching the DECRED network. Instead of adjusting every 216 blocks, roughly 2 weeks, it adjusts, every roughly 12 hours. And so Bitcoin and DECRED saw similar hash rate drop-offs when the Chinese miners got kicked out, but DECRED only had slow blocks for about a day before it adjusted, whereas Bitcoin's slow blocks, were extended out a couple of weeks. So it is, to answer your original question, yes, there is that 21 million cap, and just more broadly, DECRED takes a lot of things from Bitcoin because it originates from that Bitcoin software that the DECRED developers originally wrote.
Mm-hmm. So now, like with Bitcoin, now if you started off with a server back in, I don't know, 2009, 2010, you probably could have run the node off of a Raspberry Pi, right? You can't do that now. DECRED, is that going to be kind of a similar situation where you might not need so like be heavy on your resources in order to run a node, but then gradually, as the chain gets longer, it becomes really cost prohibitive because you need to have all of those. You need to have that data saved somewhere. I mean, that's the nature of the blockchain, that the chain is there. What are you doing as far as that? Because it will eventually become prohibitive in the long run, years down the line.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. And this goes back to that peer-to-peer architecture, that file sharing network. If you can't run the blockchain on consumer grade hardware, the number of nodes that you'll have on your network will be dramatically diminished, because it just becomes very difficult for somebody to run a node in their own house. Where if they can, have a laptop that they can dedicate to a node, it becomes much easier, and those barriers to entries are much lower. So, like you said, the amount of data that's stored on chain is something that we try and minimize as much as possible, right? So the DECRED blockchain, it's somewhere between 5 and 10 gigabytes right now, but that's it doesn't have any technical reasons for being necessarily better than Bitcoin in this regard. Like, as DECRED grows, DECRED, the size of the blockchain will grow similar to the size of the Bitcoin blockchain. And so the way you have to, just be very cognizant of this and minimize the amount of data you're storing on chain is to just, during the development process, use architectures that only put data on chain that absolutely have to be on chain. An example of this is Politeia, our proposal system. And so instead of having all of this data, actually like funding data or proposals that teams put up, instead of having all of that actually stored on the blockchain itself, that would be very expensive. What we do is we store it off chain on some type of centralized database, but then we timestamp the data onto the DECRED blockchain. So cryptographic timestamping is this way to prove that data existed and has not been altered since a specific block height. And the way you do that is that you can take an arbitrary amount of data, right? You can take gigabytes and gigabytes of data, and you use a construct called a Merkle tree to essentially hash that data down to a single hash. And then that single hash is included in a DECRED transaction. So that hash is timestamped forever onto the DECRED blockchain. And then you can use software to basically go from point A, like some document that got timestamped, you can get what's called the Merkle path. And that allows you to prove that this document in this exact form was part of this Merkle root, this hash that was included in the DECRED transaction, that was timestamped on the DECRED transaction. And this gives you cryptographic proof that this data existed at a specific block height and has not been altered since. So there are various architectures that you can use to minimize the amount of data that you put on chain. The Lightning Network is another one, and that is something that we're very aware of, very cognizant of, and always trying to keep blockchain bloat at a bare minimum, because in our view, that peer-to-peer architecture, the ability to run this blockchain on consumer grade hardware, is incredibly important for the security and longevity of the network.
Mm-hmm. So, I mean, to kind of simplify it, if I'm understanding correctly, you basically take the history of the blockchain, maybe the information that you don't need but you don't want to lose, kind of compress it, put it into one block, and then you put it on basically an archive, but it's still searchable.
Well, it's compress. The terminology compress it might be a little misleading, because you can't, when you hash down data, you run data. So if your viewers not familiar with the term like a hashing or a hash function, a hash function is a cryptographic primitive that allows you to take an arbitrary amount of data and then as input, and then it runs it through a function and it outputs a fixed length set of bits. So basically a fixed length alphanumeric string, let's just say that's 64 characters long, right? So you can take an entire book and run it through this hash function, and it will result in the same 64 character long hash every single time. And one of the properties of this is that you can go one way. You can always go from the book to that hash, and as long as the contents of the book is the same, if you change even like a single period or a single bit, it will result in a completely different hash. But as long as you keep the contents of that input the exact same, it will always result in that output. But you can't go the other way around. You can't take the output and figure out what the input was. And so, whereas like with compression and decompression, I think of it more in terms of compressing data down, you're minimizing the data, but then you can also decompress it to get back to your original data. But yes, you're using these cryptographic primitives to be able to prove that this data existed at this block height and has not been altered since. But you're not actually, like, the data itself is not searchable unless that centralized database allows for that. Like I can give you the data from the centralized database. You can use that data to then check the timestamp. Yes, this is the correct data. It hasn't been changed. But the data is not actually being stored on the blockchain.
Mm-hmm. And Luke, we actually blew past our half an hour. Are you good to go? Because I've got a few more questions. All right, sweet. I've got a quick bump that I'm going to put in here, and then we'll be right back after this.
Check it out. MobileEdge.com has award-winning products with innovative features and contemporary, edgy designs that empower you to look sharp and travel smart with your mobile tech. Your beloved, not to mention expensive gaming gear and mobile tech devices are an extension of you, so give them the protection and style they deserve wherever you go. Find them at MobileEdge.com and protect your tech with Mobile Edge. Bring it on. Hey Geek Insiders, Mobile Edge has a special coupon code for our dedicated listeners. Get 25% off your Mobile Edge gear using coupon code GEEK25. That's GEEK25. Geek out.
Okay, and we are back with Luke Powell. He is one of the developers over at DECRED, and a font of information as far as blockchain and what is going on over at DECRED. Now, speaking of which, there was a press release not too long ago saying that it was the very first DAO, Decentralized Autonomous Organization, in the crypto space. What is that? What is that for those who don't know?
So DAO, it's basically been turned into like buzzwords at this point. So the definition has become very convoluted. Different people have different definitions, but my definition of a DAO is, and how it applies to DECRED is, it is a way for it. So let's say I wanted to, collaborate with people and start a company, right? With doing that, one method would be to form an LLC with those people, right? So with a DAO, though, if I wanted to launch a entirely digital product, and I was working with developers all over the world, maybe I don't know who they are, maybe they're pseudonymous. You don't have to have your identity attached to your work anymore. I work with people in DECRED that I don't know who they are. They're just completely pseudonymous. Well, how do you do this? The typical corporate or company structure just doesn't really fit this new type of collaboration. And so what a DAO is, it is essentially a internet native company, meaning when you use a cryptocurrency wallet as the company's bank account, you don't have to have identities attached to the people you're working with anymore. So instead of, I'm working with these pseudonymous individuals all over the world, instead of trying to go through the pain of like setting up this traditional corporate structure, a DAO is a internet native corporation where you have cryptocurrency as the bank account, and then you have this suite of tools that allow you to collaborate and build out this digital product with these, various people spread all throughout the world. So it's an internet company not tied to any one physical location or even people's identities.
Well, and I did want to speak to that about anonymity. Okay, so we know like Monero is like, anonymous. We love that concept of like hiding our resources so that, your local government isn't like always sticking their hand in your pocket. There's got to be a lot of pushback as far as government agencies when it comes to taxing things, hiding things, kind of getting into trouble with that. Has DECRED been able to kind of jump over those hurdles for the U.S. market, for example?
So somebody who's going to avoid taxes, like there's various privacy tools, I guess, they can use to do that. But that's not like the point of a DAO. The point of a DAO is to allow collaboration on a global scale. It's up to the individual. Like I still, pay normal taxes. I get, even though all my income is in DECRED, right? But I still, report that and pay taxes on it just like I would normally, because those are the regulations of the country I'm living in. It's up to the individuals to still adhere to all of their local regulations and policies. A DAO is not meant to, be used to break the law. It's this collaboration mechanism that allows collaboration and coordination on a scale that wasn't really possible before. And so I don't really view it necessarily as an issue for the government, essentially. Like if somebody's going to avoid taxes, they're probably going to figure out ways to avoid taxes no matter what. Like they're going to use various technologies to do that. Just because they use, cryptography or encryption to hide, maybe their chats or things like that doesn't mean that, that technology is inherently bad. Technology, any sophisticated technology can be used for both good and bad purposes, right? We have, on one hand, you have nuclear energy, but then that same technology can be used for, atomic bombs. Or, on one hand, we have the internet, which allowed this amazing ability to share information on a global scale, but then it also comes with a whole bunch of problems too. And so I would say that like DECRED, we don't really get into that domain at all. Follow your local regulations, don't break the law. That's on you. It's not really, there is really no overlap with, the project or the project's goals or anything like that.
Okay. Yeah. Because with regulations and stuff, cryptocurrency is global. What DECRED is in the United States might be the same as in Germany or South America and stuff like that. So it's the new money, but people have a hard time adopting it. I mean, heck, I remember when people were like, debit card. It's like, no, I want to hold on to my cash. Now everybody's like, no, I don't want to hold on to cash. I want my debit card. And it's almost like now your crypto wallet is out there, and so I think they have a hard time wrapping their brain around the fact that there are real world applications for this. In fact, you even said that your income is in DECRED. It's like, well, okay, well, somebody who's listening in going, well, how do you pay your bills?
Yes, hopefully one day I won't have to convert to fiat to US dollar in order to pay my bills. That technology isn't quite ready yet. That will mostly be like the Lightning Network as it scales out. But for now, I just have to sell DECRED into US dollar on, an exchange, and then transfer that to my bank account and use that to pay my bills. But also I also think another, concept that really should be pushed back on, is this concept that like privacy is inherently like bad or only criminals use privacy. This is a line that governments take all the time, and it's just not true. Like we should be building privacy preserving technologies because they preserve individual freedoms and liberties. That not because using privacy or using a DAO or having a entirely pseudonymous career, that's not something that should be looked down upon or looked at, with any type of negative connotation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I absolutely agree. I mean, and a lot of people are like, oh, well, just because I can't see exactly what you're doing doesn't mean I'm doing something nefarious. It's not all, we're not all on the Silk Road, if you will.
Right. Well, I mean, the failure mode of a society where everything is monitored is, authoritarian governments eventually taking over. Even if like the monitoring is imposed by people with good intentions, eventually, people with bad intentions take over and use the system to then just, maintain power and do what authoritarian governments always do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So now, but now you did say an exchange, and DCRED does have the DCRDEX.
Yes.
Um, is that open to all markets? And what other tokens and cryptocurrencies does it exchange? Because there are some who are kind of like, I want to say like vanity almost. You know,
Mm-hmm.
they limit themselves to only a certain amount of cryptocurrencies and things like that. Can you tell us a little bit more about the DEX?
Sure. So Decred decided to go down this route of building its own decentralized exchange. And one of the reasons is because, as we talked about earlier, these fiat on ramps and off ramps, they have a lot of power over these projects because of their ability to, pull liquidity away at any moment. And it doesn't have to be, for any reason that makes sense, right? This would be, if an authoritarian government wanted to crack down on a cryptocurrency, the easiest way to do it would be on the fiat on ramps and off ramps, and to basically just kill the liquidity. So long term, for cryptocurrencies to survive, you need to be able to transact in a peer-to-peer fashion, exchange two cryptocurrencies in a peer-to-peer fashion, just like you would send a DECRED transaction in a peer-to-peer transaction. And people who are listening to this, they might be familiar with DEXs on Ethereum. And what the DECRED DEX is, it's quite different. So a DEX on a smart contract platform like Ethereum, that is basically an on-chain DEX, where the equivalent of the order book, they use these things called liquidity pools, but the equivalent of the order book is all that data is stored on chain, essentially. Whereas what DECRED does, and with those smart contract DEXs, you can only exchange assets that are part of the smart contract platform. So basically tokens on Ethereum. And then they have, like wrapped Bitcoin, which is a Bitcoin token on Ethereum, but it's a custodial, it's a custodial solution. It's not a decentralized peer-to-peer solution, non-custodial. And so what DECRED DEX is, it uses a technology called atomic swaps. And this is very different than something like, Uniswap on Ethereum. An atomic swap allows two people that are holding different cryptocurrencies, it's like Bitcoin and DECRED, to exchange those cryptocurrencies across the chain. And the transaction bridges the chain, and they swap those cryptocurrencies. And so this primitive allowed us to build out this truly, non-custodial peer-to-peer, or it's not peer-to-peer yet, but the atomic swap part is a peer-to-peer transaction. The actual DEX order book is still part of a centralized exchange, but it allowed us to build out this new type of DEX, essentially, is what I'm getting at. That is not the same as these DEXs run on smart contract platforms. So right now, the only pairs on it are Bitcoin, the Bitcoin and Bitcoin DECRED pair. So you can swap Bitcoin to DECRED or DECRED to Bitcoin. But work is currently being done. That was just the initial launch. DECRED takes a very incremental approach to this type of technology, putting things out and always pushing incremental improvements, push forward, push forward, push forward. So currently, the second phase is being worked on, and that's going to add assets like Ethereum onto it. It's going to add a stable coin. I forget which one. I believe it might be Tether, maybe USDC, or both. But it will have these other assets that you'll be able to swap in and out of DECRED with. So instead of having to use a centralized exchange, I'm in the US, so the exchange I use for DECRED is Bittrex. That's really the only one available to US customers right now. But instead of using a centralized exchange, if I wanted to, I could just then use the DECRED DEX once these new pairs are added and swap into a stable coin, or swap into Bitcoin. And then I can basically, even if DECRED isn't listed on a Coinbase, I can still swap into a stable coin or swap into Bitcoin and then sell that stable coin or Bitcoin on Coinbase itself. So it's a way for DECRED to piggyback on Bitcoin's liquidity. Bitcoin spent years and years building up all of this infrastructure for these fiat on ramps and off ramps. And for any other individual cryptocurrency to compete with that would be very, very difficult. There's a lot involved in that process. But if I can atomic swap, permissionlessly into Bitcoin or into a stable coin from DECRED, then I automatically have access to all of those centralized exchanges, essentially. So I don't even need DECRED to be listed on these exchanges for me to then be able to sell DECRED or be able to use these exchanges to convert to fiat, because I can use the DEX to swap into Bitcoin, and then Bitcoin sell that on the exchange into fiat. And so it allows DECRED as the project to basically be in charge of its own destiny. It doesn't, the centralized exchanges no longer have the same power over DECRED as they do these other cryptocurrency projects, because they don't have the power to yank that liquidity away at any moment. And this is an incredibly important point that not very many projects are thinking like this. Not very many projects are doing this, but long term, it's going to be absolutely important for the long term success of any type of cryptocurrency that wishes to be a store of value and wishes to be to facilitate personal freedoms and individual liberties, and to fight back against authoritarianism.
Yeah, and I'm really glad that you mentioned atomic swaps, because that was something that that I'd heard about maybe about a year and a half, almost 2 years ago, like brand new, and it was so exciting because it was like, the problem was, how do you get one chain to talk to another without going through all of these hoops, and then and worrying about the fees and everything like that. It's just like super quick. You have that exchange. It's like, hey, Luke, I've got like 10 Ethereum. You wanna swap it with whatever it is, with DECRED, and you're gonna be like, no, man, I'm holding on to my DECRED. And I'm like, come on, man, But anyway, by having that peer-to-peer exchange, like really super quick and things like that, it helps that whole onboarding process, because again, I think people are only just starting to wake up to the real world applications of what cryptocurrency can do. I know for me, again, before we went live, I was telling you that I was on the Steam network for, when it started about 6 years ago, and as a community member, I was putting out content and I was earning Steam from that. And I was powering up because I wanted my vote to matter, and, voting in my witnesses and things like that, the minors. And I was able to use that, jumping through tons of hoops and a huge learning curve, to pay bills when I really needed it, and so that was really prohibitive to a lot of people. They're like, oh no, I don't get it. I don't understand it. I'm staying away from it. But it sounds like what you guys are doing, what you're developing with the wallet, with the exchange, the atomic swaps and things like that, is really allowing people like, a regular person like me, to go out there and say, I've got crypto and I need a cup of coffee and go out and be able to use it.
Yeah. No, one kind of thing that sets DECRED apart too is the fact that, so we never really talked about the DECRED Treasury, but DECRED has this Treasury where part of every block reward goes in the Treasury, and that's how we pay for this development. So that allows us to have a very integrated product, meaning the DECRED desktop wallet has integrations for everything that we've been talking about. You can send normal transactions, you can send Lightning Network transactions, you can vote on governance issues, and the DEX is actually being built to the DECRED desktop wallet too. So you'll actually be able to swap in and out of these assets directly from the DECRED wallet. So the DECREDaton is the desktop wallet. The DECREDaton DEX integration, it's not quite ready for prime time yet. In order, you can use it, absolutely, but it also requires currently running both a DECRED full node and a Bitcoin full node in order to perform the swaps. The phase 2 of this development, the next release is going to include what we call SPV support, and that will basically eliminate the need to run a Bitcoin node. And so you'll be able to do these swaps for DECRED, Bitcoin, DECRED, other tokens or coins, without having to actually run those nodes all in this integrated experience in the DECRED desktop wallet. And really no other project has anything close to this degree of integration that we have. And it's only going to keep getting better. Open source software typically starts out pretty rough and just continues to improve over time. And just like with that's what you see with all the DECRED software, really. Well,
if you don't mind speaking a little bit more about the Treasury, because there's a certain percentage from the mining and everything that goes into that, right? So all of the transactions and things, there's a little percentage that goes in. before, I mean, it would make sense that before you release the wallet, you had to have a certain amount because you can't have a treasury with zero in it. What was the process? Was that something that was already programmed in, something that was thought ahead?
Yeah, so this is actually, kudos to the original team, because they basically didn't touch the treasury for at least the first year, I think a little bit longer than that. They let it build up over and accumulate DECRED and get it to where it's at now. But the DECRED, taking a step back a little bit, the DECRED treasury, is part of this governance aspect of a cryptocurrency. DECRED set out to solve this problem of how are decisions made in a decentralized project and how are those decisions paid for, right? Because the various mechanisms for funding cryptocurrency development tends to either be a VC-backed company or which, long-term, that the incentives of a VC-backed company don't necessarily align with the incentives of the cryptocurrency holders. What's good for the company might not be good for the holders. And so you get that misaligned incentives, which creates the potential for just bad behavior. You have the community donation model. This is the model that Monero uses, where basically you put up development proposals and then community members will just donate and will fund things that way. This has worked pretty well for Monero to date, but the long term, I question whether it's scalable long term. This works really well, especially when cryptocurrencies are doing great. But as time goes on, as the potential 100x gains aren't quite there anymore. What will the community still be willing to fund? This development, is it a sustainable model? And I don't think that question has been answered yet. So what DECRED does is, because we have the ability to have the DECRED stakeholders vote on things, we have a treasury, and 10% of every block reward, that is the new DECRED being created every day that the proof of work miners mine, 10% of that automatically gets set off to the side into the DECRED network treasury. And then the DECRED stakeholders, people who own DECRED and are locking it up staking, they vote on how those funds are allocated. And kind of what I alluded to earlier, I have a development team, and all of our work is paid for out of the DECRED treasury. All of my income comes from that DECRED treasury. And that allows us to have this sustainable funding mechanism that, will last for decades, centuries to come, as long as the project keeps being successful. And it is going to be a network effect that these other projects just won't be able to compete with long term, I don't think. DECRED, the benefits, all of these incremental improvements will just compound over time, and it will get to a point where it will just be, it will create very, very strong network effects, in my opinion. And just to answer that original question, how did this originally build up? All of the original DECRED work was paid for completely out of pocket by the original developers. There was a pre-mine. So because you need votes you need that proof of stake side to validate the proof of work blocks, you have to bootstrap that. So you had to have this initial distribution in order to have the staking in order to validate the block. So there is a 8% pre-mine, 4% went to the original team, but that was all for reimbursing out-of-pocket expenses that they paid to up to that point.
It was time and servers.
Yeah, and the rate at which they got that pre-mine was 48 cents per DECRED, which was the same market rate that it traded at for basically the entire first year. And then that other 4% went to an airdrop to people that signed up in order to bootstrap that proof of stake aspect. And during the first year and a half, I forget the exact numbers, but nothing was taken out of the DECRED treasury. It was allowed to build up over time because DECRED was trading at 50 cents per DECRED, right? So, if you had been billing against the treasury, you would have just crushed all of it. Whereas now, all of that original DECRED that they let build up over time, the treasury is sitting at 600, I think almost 700,000 DECRED, which at the current price of, what are we at, 150 or something like that? You're talking, over $100 million. And that is a sustainable funding source that developers and DECRED teams will be able to use for a very long time.
Yeah, I mean, so smart to do that. Especially at the very beginning, because you don't go into a project thinking, oh, we're going to fail in a year. No, you want it to succeed. And so building in that sustainability is so smart. I did want to talk about staking for the regular Joe Schmo who's kind of getting in and saying, hey, this looks like a really solid project and I want to be a part of it. how would they onboard and begin staking their DECRED? Because again, I've got two. It's all I can afford right now. But I'm accumulating. Crypto savvy that I am, right? You're gonna start somewhere,
Absolutely.
folks.
Yeah, everybody starts somewhere.
But so you want to accumulate and things like that. And again, I love the idea that it's finite, because eventually there isn't going to be any more to mine, and that means that as long as you guys are around, it is going to increase in value. We hope, knock wood. But as you accumulate and you want to put more skin in the game, if you want to stake, if you want to become a miner, what is the onboarding process like?
So if you want to stake, easiest way to do it is through the DCRED desktop wallet, DCREDiton. Like I said, we got everything built in there, integrated. For most of this stuff, there's like setup instructions and little helpers and stuff. But essentially, the way staking works is you lock your DCRED up for a random period of time of up to 4 months. And you buy what we call a ticket. That ticket gets put into the stake pool. The stake pool targets roughly 41,000 tickets, and the price per ticket adjusts dynamically based on supply and demand, right? So, last week the ticket price was 180 DCRED per ticket. A bunch of people bought tickets, and now it's sitting at like 200 DCRED per ticket. And so it's just a dynamic adjustment based on supply and demand. And when a proof of work block gets mined, the block hash is used to deterministically select 5 tickets from the ticket pool. Those tickets vote on the validity of a block, and then they get a reward for performing that service and helping secure the network. I believe the proof of stake block reward is roughly 0.75 DCRED for every ticket that votes right now. And that diminishes over time along with as the block reward diminishes, as the inflation rate diminishes. So the important thing to note, though, is if you're staking through DECREDiton, you're going to use what we call a stake pool most likely. So because your stake can be selected at any time of day to validate a block, right? You have to have a computer on for 24 hours a day, reachable 24 hours a day. This isn't practical for most people. So we have what's called stake pools. You basically delegate that voting to a stake pool, similar to like a mining pool. They can't spend your DCRED. You're not giving up custody. They can't do anything but vote for you. And then they take like a small part of that block reward that you get back. So sum it all up. If you want to stake, you buy DCRED on an exchange, you download the DCRED desktop wallet, and then you use that to set up a stake, or to get integrated with a stake pool, and that stake pool stakes for you. The entire process is pretty simple at this point, and the DECREDiton wallet, I believe, does a really good job at like walking you through how to do everything. So yeah, just download that desktop wallet and take it for a spin.
All right. Definitely something that I'm going to be looking into. Now, we are almost at our hour, Luke. It went by pretty fast. Is there anything that we didn't cover, anything that you want to talk about, something that is burning in your soul that you need to speak about DECRED?
Like the one big area that we didn't cover was privacy. But
yes,
we can just cover it real quick. So
yeah.
Bitcoin, in my opinion, its two biggest blind spots are essentially governance, right, and privacy. It doesn't have base layer privacy, right? So actually governments are all about this because this gives them, the ability to just see everybody's transactions. But, a transparent blockchain, is an authoritarian government's wet dream. Like they're all about that. China is launching their own, stable coin specifically for this reason, for so the surveillance aspects. And so unfortunately Bitcoin wasn't able, the plan was always to integrate privacy, but they weren't able to integrate privacy before they got Wall Street on board. And now I think it's gonna be very, very unlikely, if not impossible, to integrate base layer privacy at this point. DECRED, on the other hand, uses what's called a coin join, but it's a type of mixing. So our approach to privacy is that the base layer should always be kept transparent and as simple as possible. Complexity is the enemy of security, right? And so there are other projects that obfuscate their base layer in order to add these privacy techniques, Zcash being one, Monero being one. The problem with this is that you obfuscating the blockchain for privacy reasons also means that you're obfuscating potential bugs that exist. An example being back in 2018 or early 2019, somewhere around there, Zcash had an infinite inflation bug, meaning a bug in their implementation that would have allowed somebody to create an arbitrary amount of Zcash, like that they could then send to the exchange and sell. And they caught it before anybody did, or before they don't think anybody was able to exploit it. And their justification was essentially, these ZK snarks are incredibly complex cryptography. There's only a small number of people in the world that have the knowledge, the domain knowledge, to be able to figure a bug like this out, and we employ most of those people. That's not what you want for a store of value. Like a store of value,
no confidence there.
Yeah, confidence is everything. And so, this approach, this transparent approach of mixing coins, which is essentially, you can think of it like taking a bunch of transactions, denominated all in the same size, putting them in a hat, mixing them all up, and then pulling them all out. So you can't tell who sent the transactions. You can tell that the same amount are there, everything's transparent, but you break the link between the sender and the receiver, essentially. Now, the problem with this has always traditionally been that what's referred to as the anonymity set. When you have optional privacy techniques, the biggest hurdle is getting people to use them, because if not enough people use them, then you don't properly break those links between inputs and outputs. Somebody can use sophisticated software to basically analyze it and say, oh, I actually can trace you. So the genius behind DECRED's implementation is that we integrated this mixing into staking, right? So in Bitcoin has this mixing, but in order to do it, you have to be continually churning these Bitcoin transactions, which is very expensive. You're sending these transactions solely for the purpose of this additional privacy benefit, but each time you have to pay these transaction fees, and it just gets expensive. And the more congested Bitcoin gets, more expensive it will be. So with DECRED, we attach it to a transaction that you were already going to send, this staking transaction. And so you're not paying anything additional, and you essentially get this privacy feature for free. And it's using staking, which right now over 50% of the circulating supply in DECRED is being staked. And so DECRED has a massive anonymity set compared to these other products that try and implement mixing, because of the game theory that we added to this whole mixing process. And I think I can't remember the numbers off the top of my head, but it's something like 40% of all DECRED in circulation has been mixed at some point or another, which is just orders of magnitude more than any other project that tries to do this thing. And it's because of that hybrid proof of work, proof of stake consensus mechanism, and the game theory of adding privacy onto that staking transaction, that transaction you're already going to send. So that's DECRED privacy in a nutshell. Again, that's also integrated into Decrediton. If you want to have your DECRED participate in this mixing, you can do it with staking or you can do it without staking. But with staking, it just makes it really easy and gets that really large anonymity set.
Well, I mean, and kudos to the development team again for thinking about that ahead of time, because as you said, Bitcoin, maybe that was on their roadmap, but when it started becoming mainstream news, and all of a sudden, the governments are looking at it going, how do I get a piece of that pie? And then again, people, there's been a big debate about whether anonymity is real. I mean, that's out there, but being able to kind of put everything into the pool, have it mixed up, and then out again, it's a lot harder to trace, especially when you have that many people who are participating in the network and doing that. It's almost like I can't remember that game that was out there, but yeah, I mean, it's just really that much harder to trace. And so that's a testament to forward thinking with you guys.
Yeah, absolutely. And like, to your point, you really have to, I think it's like you have to mix it really 6 or 7 times in order to really get sufficient privacy. And that's just very difficult to do when, you're having to pay for those additional transactions. So yeah, privacy is hard. privacy on the base layer is very hard. And so, yeah, even if you mix your DECRED just once or twice, that's not probably going to be sufficient. You need to be doing this continuously for extended periods of time if you really want that privacy. And that's where that staking aspect comes in.
And the other thing that I noticed also was that you don't require a KYC, which a lot of other exchanges and wallets require these days.
So as far as DCRDEX,
yeah,
or so the reason
I think it was DCRDEX, yeah.
Yeah. So the reason is because the DCRDEX is non-custodial, because these atomic swaps are peer-to-peer, right? There is no intermediary ever taking custody. And the FinCEN regulations or guidance that they've outlined, custody is basically the key point. If some entity takes custody of the coins, it is then a money transmitter. Like all of the legal cases against Bitcoin mixers, things like that, they all hinge on the mixer taking custody of the asset. So what DCRDEX is that you can do the atomic swaps allow us to do these swaps hands off. DCRDEX is basically, there's a centralized server component, but it's basically just a fancy Craigslist. It's an order book aggregator. You go, you post up, hey, I have this amount of DECRED or Bitcoin, and I'm selling it at this price. And then it gives the two parties the information they need to facilitate the swap. But there's no custody. And so because there's no custody, because it's just a fancy bulletin board, you don't need KYC or AML using existing regulation, based on existing regulations.
Nice. Yeah. I mean, so it's, I love that. Again, peer-to-peer, and it speaks to a true free market. You have the choice to pay X amount of price because you see it listed there. You're making that choice.
Absolutely. Mm-hmm. And you can't you have to, in order to post a transaction on the DEX, you actually have to sign something using the key from those coins. So you're not going to have spoofing. You're not going to have, like high frequency trading and things like that. It's anytime you're dealing with these decentralized systems, it's going to be slower. It probably might be a little more difficult, but that's the price you pay for the decentralization and that and just the properties that comes along with that, right? A centralized server is always going to be faster. It's always going to be able to give a better UX. So just keep that in mind as you're using these services. You're using them because of the properties, the decentralized properties and peer-to-peer properties that they exhibit. But that doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to be faster or have better UX than their centralized counterparts.
Mm-hmm. So I'm going to ask one more question before I let you go, if you don't mind. When it comes to like people's keys, I've learned really the hard way: do not lose your keys. All right, because you will never be able to get your wallet back. You'll lose all the crypto that might be in it. Are there any safeguards for people who have that oops moment?
So key management is probably the hardest issue for mainstream crypto adoption. And there's no easy answer, right? With the responsibility of being your own bank or having custody of your assets, that comes with a lot of responsibility. It comes with a lot of power, the ability to basically take your assets with you anywhere in the world permissionlessly, but it comes with that responsibility too of having to custody your assets yourself. So if my personal recommendation is if you're buying DECRED or running a DECRED wallet and you're staking, get a separate computer that's all you use it for. It doesn't have to be a very powerful computer, but it just should be separate from your daily driver. And then as far as key management goes, I don't really have any tips besides there's a lot of industry. There's plenty you can find on that. I'm not going to be able to add any value to that discussion, to be honest.
Yeah. So again, do not lose your keys. In fact, I personally have several flash drives and lots of redundancies and stuff. And I even have a notebook. I know it sounds morbid, but in the event of my death, it has all of the instructions in there for my family and my friends, to say, okay, this is where everything is. This is how you get access to it, and highly recommended, because again, this cryptocurrency, there is accountability, personal accountability, if you want to make sure that your assets are safeguarded.
Absolutely.
moving
That
forward.
comes with any technology that promotes freedom. The more freedom you have, the more accountability you have to, that comes with that.
Mm-hmm. Well, Luke, we are past our hour, and I appreciate you for being here. Do you have any final words before we get out of here?
Thanks for having me on. I enjoyed this chat. This was a good one.
I really appreciate you being here. And for everybody who's tuning in, we are simulcasting to Geek Insider, Indie Volt, Ragin AVC, wherever it is that you're tuning in from. Make sure that you hit the subscribe button. Head over to DECRED as well. Check them out and go to Geek Insider. We've got plenty of articles and press releases coming from them. On that note, you guys have a great afternoon. Stay safe, stay productive, and be kind to one another. Geek out.
At Geek Insider, we foster relationships with those in the geek sphere so we can give our audience the insider view of entertainment, tech, and more.